2 weeks ago, the world watched the United States vote for a new president, but the outcome still remains undecided. While Joe Biden appears to have won, counting continues in some states, and incumbent President Donald Trump is pursuing a flurry of lawsuits in an effort to overturn results. Now, with all major U.S. media having called the election in favor of Biden and world leaders offering their congratulations, is President Trump likely to admit defeat and concede? Is America's system to blame for the delay in announcing results? And what direction will the new government take on foreign policy? To discuss these issues, I'm pleased to be joined by a satellite by Dr. Xue Chen, Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, and via Skype by Professor Robert Kelly of the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University in the Republic of Korea, and also Benoit Hardy-Chatrand, Adjunct Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Temple University, Japan. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Mengmeng. So, gentlemen, major U.S. media have called the election in favor of Biden, and yet President Trump has not only refused to admit defeat, but also launched legal challenges to the result. And it all seems that things have come to a deadlock. So, Professor Kelly, how long before President Trump concedes?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very surprising, of course, that he has not. No American president ever done what he's trying to do. So to be perfectly honest, I don't really know, and I don't think anyone knows. I really think we are in sort of uncharted waters. On the one hand, this looks like it's close to illegal, right? I mean, that's why you hear people suggesting it's somehow kind of like a legal coup or something like that. On the other hand, it looks like the kind of stunts we've become accustomed to from Donald Trump over the years, right? It looks like the kind of farcical behavior with these nonsense lawsuits and sort of strange characters running the campaign. So it's kind of a bizarre mix, right, of sort of typical Trumpian behavior and sort of something really new and potentially really outlandish. To answer your question, I do think eventually he'll concede. If I had to put a date on it, I would probably say before the Electoral College certifies the results, which I think is in about 2 or 3 weeks. It's not really quite clear to me what the president's endgame, where this is really going, right? Because, I mean, he pretty clearly lost. I mean, if he manages to change the election, it's going to look like some kind of an overthrow of the U.S. government or something like that. I just can't imagine that would happen.
So you're saying that we probably have to wait until the Electoral College to confirm the result, and that only leaves 14 days before the presidential inauguration. So, Dr. Xue, what could happen between now and then?
As Professor Kelly has mentioned, that we are entered into the uncharted water. Since obviously President-elect Joe Biden has won the election, and also a lot of U.S. political traditions, customs has been broken. So we just really don't know what could happen before the next year's January 20th. A lot of things now is in this uncertainty, including the domestic affairs in the U.S. and also the foreign policy. Mama.
Right. Well, the Republicans have filed nearly 24 lawsuits since Election Day, but have won only one case. And President Trump keeps saying that his team has evidence that could overturn the results. So, Professor Kelly, why is he not showing his cards, and what kind of evidence could possibly reverse his defeat?
Yeah, this is also an excellent question, right? I mean, it's just not clear what the Trump people have. That's why, I mean, part of me doesn't see this as like a coup. You know, part of me just thinks this is just Trump acting like Trump. This is the kind of thing that Trump has done for years, right? Sort of crazy antics and going on TV. He likes the attention. He's using this as a gimmick to raise funds, right? We know his campaign has some debts, right? Trump himself faces litigation after he leaves the presidency. So this whole thing may just be another Trumpian reality TV show stunt. As you pointed out, and as many other news people have pointed out in the last 2 weeks, there really just isn't any evidence out there. If the Trump people have something, they need to bring it forward. You know, we know that many of the lawsuits have been thrown out for precisely this reason. There isn't any really serious evidence. when you suggest what it might be, I mean, that's actually a really fascinating question. I mean, it is possible that there's fraud, right? I mean, you have 150 million people voting. It is possible there will be errors. There could be fraud. So if the Trump people actually have something, it could be genuinely interesting, and there could be a pretty serious national debate in the United States. However, I think it was the Homeland Security Department, a section of the Homeland Security Department on election security, just the other day actually said the American election was actually quite safe and had not been penetrated or in any way seriously undermined. So unless Trump's got something that just no one's seen at all before, this is just, you know, like I said, it's a stunt or something.
Well, that's probably why the election security official was the target of Trump's latest move. He actually fired Christopher Krebs. He's America's top election security official because he had dared to refute the president's unsubstantiated claims of electoral fraud and vouch for the integrity of the vote. Dr. Xue, is the firing a surprise or something perhaps predictable in the sense that Trump will not tolerate any challenges to the result?
I don't see any things like a statement by the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency talking about this is the most secure election ever in American history. I don't see this is ever a kind of a challenge against the president's statements talking about that the whole election is a fraud. But actually, this top official of this agency was just fired by this people being calling it as a temper tantrum by President Trump. So we don't know how many more the high officials will be fired in the next less than 2 months before the January 20th. But still, as President-elect Joe Biden has been talking about, it's like embarrassment with these things going on.
Yeah, well, the Government Services Administration has not yet formally pronounced an election. And of course, Trump in the meantime is, putting himself in a difficult position, and by doing so, he's also making things difficult for the Biden and Harris team for making this transition, planning to take over. What could happen in the next 9 weeks, Professor Kelly, before the next president is sworn into office?
Sure. So I think on the one hand, the good news is that this thing will almost certainly be certified. Electoral College will vote for Joseph Biden, right? And then the country broadly will come to accept this. My guess is the president will sort of go through this tantrum for a couple more weeks, and then slowly this will begin to fade away. He won't be talking about it as much, and the country will begin to sort of anticipate the inauguration. Trump himself will not concede. There's no way that Trump will actually admit that he lost. I think that's pretty clear now, right? And he will use this for grievance in the future. He will use the stolen election so he can go off and found his own TV network or something like that. But again, unless Trump has got something really fantastic as the legal process plays out and concludes in the next 2 or 3 weeks, as you were saying, with the various certifications, I mean, it's over. I mean, unless Trump overthrows the Constitution, which is just not going to happen, right? And so that means that eventually Biden will become president. I think the real issue then is how much will Trump sabotage the transition, right? Will Trump just make it continually difficult for the Biden people to prepare to take over? And the really big issue where that matters most of all is COVID, right? I mean, the United States is now sort of seeing explosive COVID numbers, right? And if Biden gets in there on January 20th and the daily case count is like 250,000 or 300,000 or something like that, Biden's going to face a massive policy choice on the very first day of his presidency. He might have to shut down the economy. And I think that's really the big background story. Once we sort of get past Trump's gimmicks, the real story is that COVID is exploding, Trump will do nothing on it, and hand Biden a massive policy disaster on the very first day of his presidency.
Yeah, how the new administration could handle things in the U.S. will largely depend on what it's left with from the previous administration. So many observers say that what Trump is doing now is a challenge to the credibility of the U.S. electoral system, and his legal challenges may undermine belief in the democratic system. Dr. Xue, is that a fair assessment? What are your thoughts?
I thought that it might not be a challenge to the electoral system. Actually, the American people made a choice. Joe Biden became the president-elect. But actually, as I said, President Trump broke a lot of American political tradition, customs. So actually, it's a kind of a challenge to the, we call it Anglo-American common law system, which based on the prior case verdicts, or we call it judicial precedents. Then all those customs, traditions have been broken, and largely this political system is a kind of, how to say, succession to the common law system, which based on the gentlemanship inside the political system. But now, although things gone, it actually is like a challenge to what the United States has always been calling for, so-called the rule-based order, when it criticized the Chinese.
Well, we are talking about a very low probability event, gentlemen, and an article published on Guardian says that, well, it actually listed 5 key areas where elections are failing, and the Electoral College was singled out as the top defect. Professor Kelly, I want to get your thoughts on this. Is really the system is to blame for?
Sure. The Electoral College, I think almost everybody at this point agrees that the Electoral College has become a real anachronism, and to the extent that it generates the possibility for a minority party to repeatedly win the presidency, that is a real problem. For most of American history, that was not actually an issue. In the last 20 years, that has become an issue. The Electoral College has allowed the Republican Party to have a reasonable shot at the presidency, even though the Republican Party continues to lose the national vote again and again. The Republican Party has not won the national vote, the popular vote for the presidency, since 1988, but one time, right? What that means then is that if you didn't have the Electoral College, you would have had a Democratic president 7 of the last 8 presidencies. I think that's really the core issue, is that if the Electoral College continues to sort of push elections to the right, that will create a legitimacy problem on the left in the United States. Beyond that, there are lots and lots of process issues about how to actually run an election for 150 million people. I actually worry about this less, I think, than other people do, in part because the United States is simply a large country with many, many voters. There are 150 million people who voted in the last election. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of moving parts. There will be mistakes. There will be human error, right? I mean, some of the things that the Trump people are talking about are not fraud. They're just mistakes because people make mistakes. And you have 150 million pieces of paper, and all that has to be counted in just a few days. I mean, our expectations for election process are actually extraordinarily high if you think about how complex it is. There are ways to make it easier. You could try to move away from paper. You know, people have discussed internet voting for 20 years now. It could be better digitized. You could have a national ID card in the United States, which would get rid of the requirement to register to vote in the United States. You have to register to vote first, and then you actually vote. That creates a lot of trouble, too. There are many ways to do this, but there are a lot of reasons why in American political culture these things have not happened before. My own guess is that the reform focus in the next decade or so will probably focus on the Electoral College because it's now so obviously unbalanced against the Democratic Party and feels unfair to their voters.
Yeah, well, some people see flaws in the system. Others blame President Trump for further dividing America with his response to racial issues, to coronavirus, as his attitudes towards bipartisan rivalry. Do you think this is a fair assessment, Dr. Xue?
I actually agree that there's a lot of flaws in the democratic system, but also this kind of system has the capability for like self-correction. And I agree with Dr. Kelly talking about that there is a human error, but there's no systematic, how to say, coordinated among states for a fraudulent election against the incumbent President Trump. So all those, so that's why there's nearly 24 lawsuits that either be rejected or they just withdraw those lawsuits. There are 7 cases being withdrawn for this so-called election fraud. So with this legal, how to say, process going on, and also the President Trump losing all those, or there's no hope for him to win those lawsuits. this is became more and clearer. And also the pressures will be on the White House to admit the American people's choice for a new administration.
Now, we've been looking at posts online, hearing what our viewers have been saying about the main issues in the U.S. election. Let's take a look at this. We've been trying to find a comment from one of the users right there, Bruce Anderson. He says that the U.S. election, in the U.S. election, COVID was the dominant issue facing the country. Economy was the bigger issue affecting my vote. Dems dominated on COVID, and equality, GOP on economy. So what are the main factors dividing America, Professor Kelly?
Oh, good grief. Wow, what a question. COVID, I think, is the most obvious one, right? And this is very bizarre because it really didn't need to be this way. You know, I live in South Korea where there's been basically national unification and consensus on how to respond to COVID. Masking is not controversial. In the United States, Donald Trump and the people in the Republican coalition have made the response to COVID extraordinarily partisan. And as best I can tell, I'm not sort of an expert in the politics of COVID, but as best I can tell, the American response to this, this really sharp right-left cleavage in the United States on COVID is unique actually in the world. I'm not sure any other country is having the kind of internal civil debate over COVID that the Americans are. Beyond that, I would imagine that much of what Biden will do will be he's sort of trying to recover, if you will, from the sort of chaos of the Trump administration, right? I think that when you say sort of like what are the big issues dividing the Americans now, a lot of it, quite honestly, is just Trump's style. Trump was very abrasive in the questions that you mentioned from that Guardian article on things like race and stuff like that. Joe Biden can do a great deal to make things easier if he just calms down and is more gentle and less sort of explosive and harsh in his rhetoric. I hope Joe Biden doesn't use Twitter very much. I think it would help all of us enormously if the president wasn't on Twitter so much and we didn't have to check it all the time, right? And so a lot of it would just be that. A lot of it would be tone and style. And then there will be larger debates about much bigger issues that have been boiling in America for a while. Infrastructure, policing. We all learned about racism and policing over the summer. Education. A lot of these issues have been around for a long time. I don't know how much movement Biden will make on those kinds of things. But just by being gentler and kinder and less abrasive and harsh than President Trump, I think Biden will make some pretty serious, he'll have a reasonable success, at least in the first few months or year or so.
But again, over the 4 years, so many things have changed for good, and it could be difficult for the new administration to really reverse that trend. Your thoughts on this, Dr. Xue?
Yes, there's been a lot of, how the relationship between China and the United States has been poisoned in the last 4 years. And I believe that the legacy of the current administration will continue. And also a lot of people has been lower their expectations for the new administrations because there's so many things has been done. And as I said, the atmosphere has been poisoned. And a lot of people have to, look upon a very humble beginning for restarting of the dialogues between the two countries. And also, as I said before, the Trump supporters will now recede. It's a political force. As you asked why people are divided in the United States, because of the technological development and also the globalization. A lot of people in the United States found themselves left behind, and also they thought that this is the the last chance to, as President Trump mentioned, make America great again. And so with this the people left behind, but on the other hand, they also have the voting power. So we've seen so many, normal development in the United States and also in the American foreign policy.
Yeah, sure. There are so many divisions to repair at home and also on the diplomatic front. There's also a lot of issues to be fixed. So let's get some more analysis now from our guest, Benoit Hardy, Chetran, excuse my French, and he is the adjunct professor of political science and international affairs at the Temple University, Japan. So, Professor, let's talk about this. China waited before congratulating Biden, but emphasized that it understands the final results are still in question. And CNN says that China has been very cautious and belated in sending the congratulations to the Biden-Harris team. Why do you think that's the case? What is China considering here?
Well, I think the Chinese reaction is or was understandable. Generally, we are seeing from the part of China a sort of cautious optimism. We keep in mind that in the last 4 years we saw the worst decline in U.S.-China relationships ever since the normalization of relationship in 1979, and I think Trump's approach to the last 4 years has really brought quite a bit of instability to not only the bilateral relationship, but to the region more broadly as well. So I think China is clearly now more hopeful for a stable relationship. The statement we have seen coming out of Beijing and in the state media over the last few days show a kind of very, very cautious optimism. Of course, China, the leadership is not monolithic. Some of the leadership thought that Trump was somewhat good for China in the sense that there was a retreat from China, from the United States, from the world stage, which gave more room for China to operate, a certain vacuum for China to fill. But in reality, I think for sure many in China are hoping for a more manageable relationship, and that's why we've seen a kind of cautious response, but in reality to a kind of cautious optimism towards the next 4 years with a new Biden administration.
But some reports suggest that Trump will likely enact a series of hardline policies towards China, making his legacy on China hard to change for the new administration. Dr. Xue, what exactly is President Trump's China legacy?
Well, I just foresee some more, hardline policies, but I cannot tell. Since we are entering into an uncharted water, what kind of the current administration's China policy in the next 9 weeks will be. Actually, if it's high, as I said, the kind of a hatred-driven, that's due to a kind of so-called the making the Chinese accountable for the COVID, which made President Trump lost the election. But we don't know what kind of policy will be look like. So we have to wait. And also we don't see in the future 9 weeks there will be a kind of a follow-up if those policies were hatred-driven, and also the Chinese will retaliate foot on foot on those policies. We just wait to see. For the future, China-U.S. relations will be more manageable, as mentioned, and also more predictable for a kind of stable U.S.-China relations in the future.
And looking beyond China, the projected winner, Joe Biden, sought to shore up ties with key Asian allies by making his first calls with leaders of Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And we've seen increased diplomacy among these three countries, the newly signed RCEP agreement. And also, do you think that this is an indication that the new administration will, resume this pivot to Asia strategy? Professor.
Oh, yes. Of course, there are many priorities. I think that the Joe Biden administration will have to deal with in terms of foreign policy. The plate will be extremely full. But of course, yes, one of the top priorities will be the return, if you will, to Asia. Now, of course, during the first administration, the two administrations of Biden and Obama, we saw the pivot to Asia. Now, of course, Biden will want to have his own signature policy, but he'll want to show that the United States is back in the region. He has talked himself numerous times in articles he has penned and in declarations that he wants the United States to reinforce its commitment to its allies in the region. So we're going to see certainly a more present United States in the region, more sustained presence in multilateral summits as well. Over the last few years, during the Trump administration, this presence has been somewhat less than stellar. They often sent officials that were not of the highest level, which has been obviously noticed in the region. That doesn't always send the right signal. So we're going to see certainly a return to Asia as one of the priorities, but there are many of them on the plate of the new American, the President-elect Joe Biden. We'll see as well some intentions to re-solidify the partnership with Europe and other partners outside of Asia as well.
Yeah, since you mentioned Europe, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell also said recently that the bloc welcomes the chance to work once again with the U.S. president, who does not consider us, which is the European Union, a foe, or believes that the EU has been set up to take advantage of the U.S. Now, what would a Biden presidency mean for Europe, and can really the new administration reset the course? Dr. Xue.
I'm not expert on the cross-Atlantic relationship, but I will see the next Biden administration would have more focus on the alliance system, alliance network in the world. So we will see, and also the European countries and the leaders have already congratulated President-elect, and also looking upon the future cross-Atlantic relationship for a European-American free trade negotiation and free trade deal, and also to work together on the so-called geopolitical challenges. So we've seen this kind of a return of the U.S. and Europe relationship to a kind of a relatively normal relationship between the two. But still, there's a lot of issues, and also I foresee the first 2 years Biden administrations will be more focused on the domestic issues, and there's so many challenges inside the United States.
Yeah.
So the foreign policy might not be the major focus.
Yeah, in terms of U.S.'s presence on the international stage, Professor, you mentioned that the Trump administration withdrew from a lot of international agreements, the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris climate change agreement, and also the WHO. So could we expect things to change from a new administration?
Yes, I do think so. The new Biden administration will be much more committed to multilateralism. That was the case as well during the Obama-Biden era. So that's going to continue. He's made it clear that he will return to the Paris Agreement. He will rejoin the WHO. Maybe there would be a return eventually to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. There are even some talks of trying to strengthen the Iran nuclear deal that Trump withdrew from about a year or two ago. So we are likely to see a much more multilateral approach, greater presence in regional forums that we talked about, reinforcement of ties with liberal democracies. There's already a talk of a summit of democracy, summit for democracy rather, next year. So there's definitely not only a change in rhetoric and change in tone and style, but also a change in the way that foreign policy operates under Joe Biden compared to the Trump administration.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for analysis. We have Benoit Hardy Sichuan, Adjunct Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Temple University, Japan, and also Dr. Xue Chen, Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Thank you so much for your analysis. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Wang Mengmang. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for other programs on the channel.